Imagine a city shimmering on a lake, its canals bustling with canoes, its temples reaching toward the sun. This was Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec world. Tonight we'll drift through its streets, past palaces where kings whispered to the gods, and into the quiet rhythm of daily life centuries ago. You'll hear how ordinary people farmed floating gardens, how warriors earned their jaguar cloaks, and why an entire civilization believed their world depended on the motion of the stars. Close your eyes. Let's step into a time before steel or gunpowder, when dawn rose over pyramids instead of skyscrapers. For the next hour, we'll move slowly through this lost world, piece by piece. You won't just learn dates and names. You'll see fish drying on reed racks, smell toasted amaranth bread, and hear the shuffle of bare feet on stone walkways. The Aztecs left no written books, but their story survives in painted codices, carved monuments, and the memories of their descendants. Settle in as we begin where every story does, at the very beginning. The Aztecs didn't always live in a city of canals and temples. Long before Tenochtitlan, they were nomadic people moving through the harsh landscapes of northern Mexico. They called themselves the Mexica, and their journey southward wasn't just a search for land, it was guided by prophecy. Their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, had promised them a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. Until they found it, they would remain outsiders. For generations they wandered. The fertile valleys of central Mexico were already claimed by powerful city-states like Texcoco and Tlacopan. These established kingdoms saw the Mexica as unwanted guests, barely tolerating their presence at the edges of civilization. At one point, they were forced to settle on the barren hill of Chapultepec, where water was scarce and the land yielded little. Even there they faced hostility. Rulers in the region eventually drove them out, pushing them toward the marshy shores of Lake Texcoco. Archaeologists have traced their path through pottery fragments and tools left behind in temporary camps. These objects tell a story of adaptation, crude early ceramics giving way to more refined designs as the Mexica absorbed influences from the cultures around them. Oral histories describe periods of hunger when people survived on wild plants and whatever small game they could catch. It wasn't an easy life, but it shaped their resilience. The lake itself seemed like the worst possible place to build a future. The water was brackish, the ground soggy and unstable. Smaller tribes had avoided settling there for good reason, but the Mexica had nowhere else to go. Then, around 1325, the prophecy finally came true. On a small island in the lake, they spotted the eagle, the cactus, and the snake, just as Huitzilopochtli had foretold. This wasn't just a story to them, it was a divine mandate. The island, though unpromising, became their home. They anchored reed mats to the shallow lake bed, piling mud and vegetation on top to create stable ground. Over time, these floating platforms would grow into the chinampas that fed their city. The first temples were simple structures of wood and thatch built where the eagle had appeared. No one could have guessed then that this unlikely beginning would lead to an empire. The Mexica still faced challenges. Their new neighbors distrusted them, and the lake's salty waters made farming difficult. But they had something now that they'd never had before, a place that belonged to them. The eagle's sign wasn't just about land, it was about destiny, and so, on that patch of swampy ground, the Aztec civilization began to take root. By the time the Spanish arrived centuries later, the story of the eagle and the cactus had become legend, retold to explain how a people with nothing had built so much. But in those early years it was simply a promise, one that turned wanderers into builders and a swamp into the heart of an empire. Building a city on water sounds impossible, but the Aztecs made it work. Their island in Lake Texcoco was unstable at first, just mud and reeds with no solid ground. To create foundations, they drove wooden stakes into the lake bed and wove giant reed mats between them. These floating platforms, called chinampas, became the basis for everything. Workers piled layers of mud, vegetation and refuse from the lake onto the mats, building up fertile soil that wouldn't sink. Over time, these patches of land grew into neighborhoods, connected by narrow canals where canoes moved instead of carts. The city's layout followed careful planning. Engineers designed a grid of canals wide enough for 2 canoes to pass, with wooden bridges that could be removed at night for security. Causeways linked the island to the mainland, built by driving pylons deep into the lakebed and filling the spaces between with rocks and packed earth. The longest stretched over 5 miles, wide enough for 10 people to walk side by side. Fresh water arrived through terracotta pipes from springs on the shore, while dikes held back the lake's salty waters from mixing with the city's drinking supply. Neighboring cities saw the Aztecs' growing settlement as a threat. The Tepanecs, who controlled the western shore, demanded tribute, food, woven goods, even prisoners for sacrifice. For years the Aztecs paid, knowing they couldn't yet fight back. They channeled their resentment into construction. Stone from nearby quarries arrived on barges, each block shaped by masons using simple basalt tools. The Templo Mayor rose first as a modest shrine, then expanded into a stepped pyramid visible from miles away. Other cities mocked their ambitions, but the Aztecs kept building. Spanish accounts describe a place that seemed to hover above the water. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote of houses white and gleaming with lime plaster, and markets so large he swore he could hear the hum of commerce before seeing it. Gardens bloomed on rooftops, and floating flower beds lined the canals. The palace of Moctezuma reportedly had rooms draped in cotton tapestries and aviaries filled with brightly plumed birds. Yet most residents lived humbly. Commoners' homes had packed earth floors and walls of adobe or woven reeds, snug against the wind coming off the lake. Smoke from cooking fires drifted over the water each morning as women ground maize on stone metates. The city never stayed quiet for long. There was always the sound of masons chiseling stone or fishermen unloading their catch at dawn. By 1500, Tenochtitlan covered over 5 square miles and housed perhaps 200,000 people. Canal traffic moved food from chinampas to market, while priests climbed the Templo Mayor's 114 steps to perform rituals. The once mockingly called Place of the Prickly Pear Cactus had become the most powerful city in Mesoamerica, but its very success would draw the attention of strangers from across the sea. Men who arrived on floating towers, armed with weapons the Aztecs couldn't yet imagine. Tenochtitlan's streets may have been dominated by temples and palaces, but its real strength came from the steady work of ordinary people. The city was organized into neighborhoods called calpulli, each with its own temples, schools, and lands. These weren't just residential areas. They were tight-knit communities where people married, worked, and worshipped together. Your calpulli determined much of your life, from the trade you learned to the tribute you might owe the state. At dawn, smoke would rise from countless homes as women began grinding maize on stone metates. The rhythmic scraping of basalt on corn kernels was the city's morning soundtrack. Archaeologists find these grinding stones everywhere in Aztec ruins, worn smooth from years of use. Men might fish from canoes or tend chinampa plots, anchoring new reed mats to expand their family's land. Children as young as 5 helped with small tasks, carrying water in clay pots or weaving simple mats from lake reeds. Social divisions were clear but not rigid. Nobles lived nearer the city center in houses with plaster walls and private courtyards. They wore cotton clothes decorated with embroidery, while commoners made do with plain maguey fiber garments. But merit could change your station. A skilled warrior might earn the right to wear bright feather ornaments, and exceptional artisans could dine in noble households. Even slaves had rights. They could own property, marry freely, and in some cases buy their freedom. The marketplace revealed the hierarchy in miniature. At Tlatelolco, the great market serving both cities, goldsmiths and featherworkers displayed their wares on mats near the center. Further out, potters stacked their bowls next to fishermen's baskets of small silvery fish. Farmers piled squash and tomatoes on reed mats, while old women sold packets of ground chili from low stools. The air smelled of toasted corn, fresh fish, and the earthy scent of cacao beans being ground into paste. Home life revolved around work and ritual. Most families lived in compounds of several buildings around a central courtyard. At night, people slept on woven mats, wrapped in cotton blankets against the lake's chill. The lucky ones might own a ceramic brazier for warmth. Women spent hours each day cooking, stirring maize porridge in clay pots or toasting tortillas on flat ceramic griddles. Men might repair fishing nets or make repairs to their canoes after supper. Trade connected this daily rhythm to the wider world. Canoes carried obsidian from distant mines for tool-making, and colorful feathers from tropical birds flocked to the city for noble headdresses. The prized quetzal feathers came all the way from Guatemala, passing through many hands before reaching Aztec artisans. Taxes were paid in goods, a basket of beans here, a rolled cotton mantle there. This web of exchange held the empire together as much as any army. For all its complexity, the system worked smoothly. The farmer knew exactly how much of his crop went to the temple stores. The mason understood his labor helped build communal structures. Even slaves could see the clear rules governing their status. It was a society built on reciprocity, the understanding that everyone's work, from emperor to potter, kept the world in balance. This balance showed most clearly during festivals, when nobles distributed food to commoners and priests led public dances. For a brief time, the strict hierarchies softened. The fisherman might share a joke with a warrior, or a weaver see her patterns admired by a merchant's wife. Then the celebration would end, and everyone returned to their stations, each playing their part in the quiet machinery that kept Tenochtitlan alive. The Aztec gods weren't distant beings in some far-off heaven. They lived in the corn swaying in the chinampas, in the steam rising from hot springs, in the last breath of a dying warrior. Their presence was everywhere, woven into daily life. This wasn't the kind of religion where gods simply watched from above. They needed constant care and feeding, like sacred fires that would go out without fuel. Every deity had two faces. Tlaloc brought both life-giving rains and deadly floods. Quetzalcoatl gave humans maize, but also watched over the morning star, sometimes demanding blood to keep it bright. Even the mother goddess Coatlicue was terrifying to behold, her skirt made of snakes, her necklace of human hands and hearts. The Aztecs didn't see this as contradictory. Life came from death, and death gave way to new life. That was the natural order. At the heart of their belief was Teotl, not exactly a god, but the divine energy that flowed through everything. Like electricity in a modern wire, it powered the world but needed constant renewal. Priests tracked this energy's ebb and flow across the sacred calendar. Some days overflowed with Teotl, making them lucky for planting or battle. Others were dangerously empty when people stayed inside to avoid misfortune. The new fire ceremony showed this balance most dramatically. Every 52 years, when the sacred and solar calendars aligned, priests waited nervously as all fires in the city were extinguished. On a hill outside Tenochtitlan they watched the stars. If the constellation we call the Pleiades crossed the zenith at midnight, the world would continue. A captive's chest was opened, and a new fire kindled in his wound. Runners carried this flame to every neighborhood in clay braziers. The divine spark renewed for another cycle. Temples weren't just buildings, they were cosmic maps. The Templo Mayor's twin shrines represented Coatepec, the mythical snake mountain where Huitzilopochtli was born. Each layer of the pyramid matched a level of the underworld. Even the steps had meaning. Priests climbed them in careful counts that mirrored the days of the sacred month. When incense smoke curled through the plaza below, it wasn't just ceremony. It was the god's breath mingling with human prayers. Sacrifice kept this delicate balance intact. Some victims were captives from the flowery wars, others volunteered for the honor. The act itself was precise. Obsidian blades, sharper than steel, bodies carefully positioned to let blood nourish the earth. Modern eyes see only brutality, but the Aztecs saw it differently. To die this way was to become teotl, merging with the divine. Victims were called precious because they held the world together with their last heartbeats. Common people participated too, pricking their ears with maguey spines to bleed onto bark paper offerings. At home, women whispered prayers while grinding corn, tossing handfuls of meal into the hearth as mini sacrifices. Every act connected to something greater, no distinction between holy and ordinary life. It was a system without cruelty or mercy, only necessity. When drought came, more blood was needed. When crops failed, the gods were hungry. Warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth became divine companions to the sun. Nothing lasted forever, not even the gods themselves. The Aztecs knew their world would one day end like before it, collapsing into chaos until the next cycle began. Until then, they fed the sun with their thoughts and the rains with their tears. The marshes of Lake Texcoco didn't look like promising farmland. The water was too salty in places, the ground too wet in others. But the Aztecs saw potential where others saw only swamps. Their solution, chinampas, became one of the most productive farming systems the world had seen. These weren't just simple floating gardens, but carefully engineered plots that could yield up to 7 harvests a year. Workers started by staking out rectangular plots in shallow water, weaving fences from willow branches to hold the shape. They layered mud from the lake bottom with decaying vegetation, building up fertile soil that floated just above the waterline. Willow trees planted around the edges did double duty. Their roots anchored the chinampa, while their leaves provided shade. Farmers dug narrow canals between plots, just wide enough for a canoe to pass. These waterways weren't just for transport. They acted as natural irrigation, keeping the soil moist even in dry seasons. At night, the water retained heat from the day, protecting crops from chill. Fish thrived in the canals, their waste fertilizing the crops naturally. Herons nested in the reeds, keeping pests under control. Maize grew tall here, its stalks reaching higher than a person. Beans climbed the corn plants naturally, while squash vines spread across the ground below, the classic 3 sisters planting that benefited all 3 crops. Amaranth provided edible leaves and protein-rich seeds, while chia plants offered nutritious oils. Farmers grew tomatoes, chilies, and sweet potatoes in rotation. The system worked so well that some chinampas are still used today near Xochimilco, producing food just as they did 500 years ago. Bad years still came. A prolonged drought in the 1450s caused widespread famine. The lake shrank, canals dried up, and crops withered. People sold themselves into slavery just for food. The Aztecs remembered this when they expanded, conquering new lands to ensure grain reserves. They built intricate systems to manage water levels, diverting springs and creating freshwater channels to reduce salinity. Teams of workers regularly dredged canals to maintain depth, piling the nutrient-rich muck back onto the chinampas. Maintenance never stopped. After each harvest, farmers added fresh layers of vegetation from the lake, water lilies, algae, whatever would decompose into rich soil. They rotated crops carefully, letting some plots lie fallow while others produced. Night soil from the city traveled by canoe to fertilize distant fields. Nothing was wasted. Even the ashes from cooking fires went back to the land. Spanish observers marveled that 1 acre of chinampa could feed 20 people, when European fields struggled to feed 8. Markets overflowed with this bounty. Vendors piled baskets with fresh produce, avocados, green tomatoes, squash blossoms. Herbalists sold medicinal plants grown in shady corners of chinampas. Flowers for rituals and festivals came from dedicated plots where blooms grew in careful rotations. The system supported not just farmers, but potters who made seed storage jars, rope makers who twisted maguey fibers into tie lines, and canoe builders who kept transportation flowing. What looked like simple floating gardens was actually a complex web of relationships between plants and pollinators, farmers and fish, soil and water. The Chinampas didn't fight against the lake's nature, they worked with it. This harmony allowed Tenochtitlan to grow into a massive city without sprawling farmland. While European cities starved if besieged, Tenochtitlan could theoretically feed itself indefinitely as long as the Chinampas kept producing and the lake kept giving. In the end, neither would fail the Aztecs, but new arrivals would disrupt the balance forever. The Aztecs recorded their world in vibrant pigments rather than letters. Scribes painted history on long strips of bark paper folded like accordions, each page alive with colorful glyphs showing battles, tributes, and astronomical events. These weren't books as Europeans understood them. They were visual symphonies where a jaguar symbol might represent both an animal and a warrior's title, where footprints showed journeys rather than describing them. Only about 15 pre-Hispanic codices survived the conquest, but they reveal a sophisticated tradition of knowledge-keeping entirely separate from alphabetic writing. European priests arriving in Mexico dismiss these painted documents as primitive until they noticed the Aztecs could recall complex histories and astronomical cycles from memory. The truth was, the codices worked more like musical notation than modern books, memory aids for trained specialists who spent decades mastering their meanings. A single glyph of a temple collapsing might represent an entire dynasty's fall, while dots and bars tracked Venus cycles across generations. Spanish attempts to translate them often missed the layers, recording just the literal image while missing its symbolic weight. The Florentine Codex, created after colonization with Aztec scribes working under Spanish priests, gives us the clearest hybrid view. Its 2,400 pages document everything from medicinal herbs to philosophical debates, preserving knowledge that might have been lost. One section describes elders teaching that true wisdom comes from the black and red ink, the sacred colors of writing. But even this monumental work filtered Aztec thought through European frameworks, straightening the circular narratives into linear chapters. Priests weren't the only keepers of knowledge. The Tonalpauque, or day counters, tracked the 260-day sacred calendar with astonishing precision. They knew Venus would appear as the morning star every 584 days, and that lunar eclipses often followed specific planetary alignments. Farmers consulted them for planting schedules tied to these cycles, planting maize when the Pleiades reached midday, harvesting beans when Orion dominated the night sky. The celestial rhythms governed everything from market days to the timing of wars. Time itself unfolded differently in Aztec thought. Their calendar stone isn't just a sun, it's 5 stacked worlds, each representing suns that had risen and fallen before this one. Where Europeans counted years in straight lines, Aztec scribes painted time as spiral patterns where history repeated in thematic cycles. A poet might compare human lives to the brief flare of fireflies, yet also see echoes of ancestral struggles in current events. This worldview allowed them to predict eclipses with homemade observatories, while believing those same eclipses signaled potential cosmic collapse. Philosophy flourished in this system. Surviving poems debate whether anything is truly permanent. Do flowers go to the region of the dead? At least their perfume remains. Riddles taught critical thinking. What is a little blue-green jar filled with popcorn, the sky full of stars? Even children learned through metaphorical challenges, grasping abstract concepts through nature metaphors rather than rigid definitions. The Spanish called this primitive yet modern. Mathematicians now study Aztec calendar math for its innovative interlocking cycles. Anthropologists recognize how glyphs conveyed complex ideas non-linearly, much like modern infographics. What looked like simple pictures to outsiders actually condensed volumes of knowledge into symbols that sparked trained memories. When conquistadors burned codices as pagan works, they destroyed not just books, but entire libraries of coded wisdom, some of which we're still struggling to reconstruct from archaeological fragments and elders' memories centuries later. The last scribes continued their work secretly after the conquest, hiding traditional knowledge in marginal notes of church documents or passing it orally through generations. Today, scholars piece together fragments like the broken mosaic of the calendar stone, each surviving shard hinting at a system that measured lifetimes rather than minutes, and saw the cosmos not as a machine to decode, but as a living pattern to harmonize with acutely observed details. The Aztecs called them Xochiaoyotl, flowery wars. These weren't conflicts over territory or riches, but carefully staged battles with sacred purpose. Neighboring city-states like Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco agreed to meet at predetermined battlefields during the dry season. Warriors fought not to kill, but to capture opponents alive. A prisoner taken in these ritual combats became more valuable than any pile of gold. Young men trained for this from childhood. At the Kalmakak schools, future warriors learned to fight with wooden swords studded with obsidian blades. These weapons, called macuahuitl, could slice through flesh with razor-sharp volcanic glass, but rarely killed outright when used skillfully. Experienced fighters aimed for the legs, disabling opponents for easier capture. Shields weren't just protection. They displayed personal insignias, celebrating past victories in intricate feather mosaics. The hierarchy of warriors unfolded like the layers of an onion. Beginners wore plain cotton armor. Those who took their first captives earned the right to paint their faces red and yellow. Elite eagle and jaguar warriors dressed in full animal regalia, feathered helmets with beaks that clacked when they moved, spotted feline pelts draped across their shoulders. The most respected could wear the prized quetzal feather headdresses that took generations of birds to produce. Priests monitored these battles like referees, watching for violations of the unspoken rules. No attacking from behind, no killing when surrender seemed likely. Fighters developed signature moves passed down through warrior families, a feigned retreat here, a sudden twist of the macuahuitl there. Successful captors underwent purification rituals afterward, their faces washed to remove the stain of combat. But the line between sacred contest and real conquest blurred over time. What began as ritual morphed into political strategy. The Aztecs increasingly targeted cities that refused to pay tribute, using flowery wars as pretexts for expansion. Captives from these battles filled the temples on feast days, their hearts offered to keep the sun moving. The Tlaxcalans, who resisted Aztec dominance longest, became regular opponents, feeding both the empire's religious needs and their own warriors' resentment. The weapons themselves reveal this duality. Archaeologists find macuahuitls with different blade arrangements, some designed to wound cleanly, others modified for deadlier strikes. Spanish accounts describe obsidian so sharp it could decapitate a horse with one swing. Ceremonial armor grew more elaborate as warfare intensified, gold and turquoise inlays marking veterans of dozens of campaigns. By the time Moctezuma II ruled, the flowery wars served multiple purposes. They trained soldiers for actual combat, intimidated rebellious cities, and supplied sacrifices for an empire increasingly dependent on them. The Aztecs didn't see this as hypocrisy, just practical adaptation. Their gods still demanded offerings, whether through ritualized combat or outright conquest. What began as sacred theater had become the engine of an empire, its warriors caught between spiritual duty and political necessity. The system worked until it didn't. When newcomers arrived from across the sea, men who fought to kill rather than capture, the rules of flower warfare meant nothing. Old enemies like the Tlaxcalans would remember the difference between combat and slaughter, choosing sides accordingly. The very traditions that built the Aztec Empire would contribute to its unraveling as warriors schooled in ceremonial battle faced opponents with no interest in sacred rules. For now, though, the cycle continued. Seasons turned, new warriors earned their feathers, and the temples drank their fill of captive blood. The empire expanded city by city, its tribute lists growing longer each year. As long as the flowery wars fed both gods and ambition, the Aztecs saw no reason to change. After all, it had worked for generations. Why wouldn't it work forever? The first Spanish ships appeared off the coast in 1519, their sails white specks on the horizon. Aztec scouts watching from the shoreline didn't see invaders. They saw something stranger. The men on those ships wore metal skins that flashed in the sun. They rode enormous, unidentified creatures 4 times the size of a deer. Some later accounts suggest the Aztecs thought these might be centaur-like beings from myth. The truth that horses and riders were separate creatures wasn't immediately obvious to people who had never seen either before. Moctezuma received these reports in Tenochtitlan with uneasy curiosity. For years, strange omens had unsettled the city. A comet tearing across the night sky, a temple spontaneously catching fire, eerie lights hovering over the lake. Priests interpreted these as signs of impending change, perhaps even the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had long ago departed eastward. The emperor sent emissaries to greet the newcomers cautiously, laden with gifts of gold and featherwork. His strategy was careful observation rather than immediate confrontation. The cultural misunderstandings multiplied as Spaniards and Aztecs interacted. Cortés' soldiers marveled at a city built on water, while Aztec nobles puzzled over the foreigners' pale skin and thick facial hair. The Spanish assumed Tenochtitlan's canals indicated poverty, not realizing the sophisticated engineering behind them. Aztec warriors tested Spanish steel against obsidian blades, finding each had advantages. The metal swords held an edge longer, but volcanic glass cut cleaner wounds. Horses terrified some scouts initially, though they soon recognized them as animals rather than monsters. Language barriers created complications. Spanish priests attempted to explain Christianity through interpreters, baffling listeners with talk of a crucified God. Moctezuma's diplomats spoke of Huitzilopochtli's prophecies, which the Spanish dismissed as pagan nonsense. Neither side fully grasped the other's view of time. The Aztecs measured in repeating cycles, while the Spanish thought in linear progress. Small gestures carried unintended meanings. When Cortés embraced Moctezuma in greeting, the emperor stiffened. Such casual contact was unheard of in formal Aztec etiquette. Trade revealed deeper differences. The Spanish coveted gold above all, while the Aztecs valued feathers, cocoa, and jade more highly. Spanish soldiers ignored sumptuary laws, wearing elite warrior costumes gifted to them, offending local leaders. Aztec merchants couldn't comprehend the Europeans' monetary system, accustomed instead to bartering with cacao beans or bolts of cloth. Medicine exposed another gap. Spanish doctors bled patients to balance humors, while Aztec healers used steam baths and herbal poultices. For months, this awkward dance continued. Moctezuma hosted the Spanish in his palace, watching them closely while consulting priests about the omens. The Spaniards marveled at Tenochtitlan's markets and temples, even as they plotted to claim them. Both sides underestimated the other. The Spanish seeing the Aztecs as primitive despite their advanced city, the Aztecs assuming the foreigners could be managed through diplomacy. Neither recognized yet how profoundly their worlds would collide. The breakdown came slowly. Aztec observers noticed the Spaniards melting down gifted artworks into crude ingots, an act of profound disrespect in a culture where artistry carried spiritual significance. Spanish soldiers grew restless, eyeing Tenochtitlan's wealth greedily while resenting local customs restraining them. Each side's patience wore thinner with every cultural misstep. What began as cautious curiosity hardened into mutual suspicion. Within a year, the delicate balance would shatter completely. By then, it was too late for Moctezuma's careful diplomacy. The omens had warned of upheaval, and the strangers proved far more dangerous than centaurs from myth. Their steel didn't just wound, it killed in ways obsidian blades never could. Their diseases, invisible travelers on European breaths, had already begun circulating in the city. The Aztec world was about to face challenges no amount of jade or gold could solve. Two civilizations stood on the brink of collision, each with weapons the other couldn't fully comprehend. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 75 days, each one draining life from the city in different ways. Cortés didn't assault the walls immediately. Instead, he cut the aqueducts first. Fresh water stopped flowing into the city within a week. People drank from the lake despite knowing the water was brackish and contaminated. Then the Spanish blockade tightened, preventing food from reaching the island. The once bustling canals grew quiet, as fishing canoes dared not venture out under Spanish guns. Hunger set in quickly. People ate frogs, algae, even the leather from their sandals. Smallpox had already weakened the city before the siege began. The disease spread through crowded neighborhoods, killing indiscriminately. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Traditional healers tried steam baths and herbal remedies, but nothing stopped the pustules that covered victims' skin. Warriors who might have defended the city lay shivering with fever instead. The Spanish, largely immune from childhood exposure, watched impassively as their invisible ally did its work. Cortés relied heavily on Tlaxcalan allies who outnumbered his Spanish troops 5-1. These longtime enemies of the Aztecs knew the city's weaknesses. They helped dismantle the causeways section by section, leaving gaps too wide for defenders to cross. Aztec warriors counterattacked at night, swimming silently across canals with knives clenched in their teeth. Some succeeded in sabotaging Spanish cannons before slipping back into the darkness. But each day, more sections of the city fell. The final assault came from all sides at once. Spanish brigantines, small warships built specially for the lake, rained cannon fire onto the remaining districts. Tlaxcalan warriors swarmed through breaches in the walls. Azure Quetzal warriors, once the Empire's elite, made their last stand on the steps of the Templo Mayor. Their obsidian blades shattered against Spanish steel, leaving them gripping broken weapons as crossbow bolts found their chests.
Civilians fared worse. Women and children hiding in canoes were capsized by brigantine oars. Elderly refugees drowned trying to swim to shore with bundles of belongings on their backs. Spanish accounts mention the lake turning red near the marketplace, though whether from blood or sunset reflections remains unclear. The stench of death hung thick over the water, mixing with the smoke of burning buildings. Moctezuma had died months earlier, under unclear circumstances. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, organized a desperate breakout attempt across Lake Texcoco under cover of rain. Spanish lookouts spotted the fleeing canoes and gave chase. They captured Cuauhtémoc, trying to slip away with his family and remaining generals. Cortés supposedly demanded to know where the Aztec gold was hidden. The young emperor pointed to his stomach, saying only, "Here, in the hearts of my people." By August 1521, the city was unrecognizable. The great marketplace where thousands once traded stood empty, looted by Spanish soldiers hunting for hidden treasures. The canals closest to the center were filled with rubble to make way for horses. Survivors wandered the ruins searching for loved ones, stepping over bodies half-eaten by stray dogs. Wrote of finding a silent child sitting beside its dead mother, too weak to cry. Another described stacks of skulls from smallpox victims towering higher than a man. The conquerors marched the remaining nobility through the ruined city, forcing them to acknowledge defeat. By design or accident, the Spanish preserved one thing: the basic layout of streets and canals. Modern Mexico City still follows this skeleton, but the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan was gone. The chinampas rotted without caretakers. The temples became quarries for Spanish churches. The canals, once navigated by skilled boatmen, shrank into polluted ditches. The silence after the siege was unnatural. No more dawn chants from temple priests, no more fish sellers calling out prices at the market. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. Tenochtitlan had been a city of constant sound, water lapping, drums beating, children laughing. Now there was only the wind through broken walls and the occasional cry of a survivor finding another body. 2 years earlier, it had been the largest city in the Americas. Now it was a graveyard. The fifth sun had set. The maize still grew after the conquest, its golden stalks bending under the same sun that had watched over Tenochtitlan. Farmers continued tending their chinampas, though now they paid tribute to Spanish landlords instead of Aztec nobles. The rhythm of planting and harvest remained, even as church bells replaced the sound of temple drums. This quiet persistence became the Aztec legacy, not in grand monuments, but in the simple act of saving seeds and telling old stories to children. Priests demanded conversion to Christianity, but many traditions survived in disguised forms. The Day of the Dead merged with All Saints' Day, its altars still offering food to ancestors just as Aztec families once did. Feasts for Tonantzin, the mother goddess, quietly transformed into celebrations for the Virgin of Guadalupe at the same sacred hill. Farmers left small offerings in fields as their grandparents had, though now they might cross themselves afterward. The Spanish called this superstition, not realizing how deliberately these practices preserved the past. Language became another battleground. Nahuatl was banned in official settings, but it thrived in kitchens and marketplaces. Friars inadvertently helped preserve it by using the language for conversion, producing Nahuatl catechisms and sermons that became linguistic records. Today, modern speakers can read 16th-century poetry in the original, hearing rhymes that survived when so much else was lost. The words for avocado, ahuacatl, tomato, tomatl, and chocolate, zocolotl, traveled intact into Spanish and English, carrying fragments of Aztec life into the future. Some rebellions were cultural rather than violent. In 1576, an indigenous painter working on a church mural slipped Aztec glyphs into the decoration, a hidden protest in brushstrokes. Midwives kept using traditional herbs despite Spanish doctors' warnings, trusting knowledge passed down through generations. Families buried loved ones with small clay figures, just as their ancestors had, though now they might include a crucifix too. These quiet acts of resistance preserved identity when open defiance meant death. The 20th century saw deliberate revivals. Anthropologists worked with Nahuatl elders to record fading traditions, how to make amatl paper from fig bark, or the proper way to grind maize with a metate. Muralists like Diego Rivera put Aztec symbols back into public view, reclaiming them as national heritage. Today, dancers in feathered headdresses perform at festivals, while scholars reconstruct forgotten songs from colonial-era manuscripts. The very tools used to erase Aztec culture, written records, academic study, later became means of its recovery. Modern Mexico still wrestles with this dual inheritance. Street vendors sell tlacoyos alongside hamburgers, their blue masa dough a direct legacy of Aztec maize varieties. Pharmacies stock both ibuprofen and zacatechy, a traditional dream herb. Nahuatl place names, from Popocatépetl to Mexico itself, mark the land, though many no longer know their meanings. The contradictions persist. A civilization officially celebrated yet still partially erased, its descendants both proud of and distant from their ancestors.
The true endurance shows in quieter places. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to shape tortillas by hand, the motion unchanged for centuries. A farmer planting maize in the old cycle, watching the stars rather than a calendar. A poet writing Nahuatl verses on a smartphone, connecting across time through syllables that once graced royal courts. The Spanish took the Aztecs' gold, their cities, their political power, but not the stubborn pulse of memory that still beats in ordinary moments. Scholars debate whether Aztec civilization truly ended or simply transformed. The answer might lie in those maize fields where modern farmers sometimes find clay figurines surfacing after rain, small voices from the past, reminding the present that some roots go too deep to disappear. The church bells toll, the matate stone scrapes against corn, and the words of a 500-year-old poem about transience still ring true. The world changed, but the essential things remained. The Aztec world had its share of kings and warriors whose names survive in stone carvings and Spanish chronicles. But history often overlooks the women who shaped that world in quieter ways. Take Macuilexochitzin, a poet whose works survived the conquest. She wasn't royalty, just an observant woman who composed verses about flowers, warfare, and the fragility of life. Her poems, transcribed by Spanish friars, give us glimpses of ordinary Aztec thought that official records miss. Women's roles surprised the Spanish. Noble women could own property, inherit wealth, and serve as priestesses. Common women ran markets, practiced medicine, and managed household finances. Their spindle whorls tell stories too carved with dates and symbols. These clay discs for spinning thread doubled as personal diaries. Archaeologists find them across Mesoamerica, some worn smooth from years of use. The Spanish expected silent, submissive women. Instead, they found legal experts like Doña Marina, the Nahua interpreter who became indispensable to Cortés, navigating two cultures with shrewd intelligence. The goddesses reflected this complexity. Tlazolteotl governed both purification and sexual desire. Midwives invoked her during childbirth, while adulterers confessed sins to her priests. Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, represented both rebellion and cosmic order, her dismembered body carved into the Templo Mayor's base, reminding visitors that chaos could be sacred. These weren't passive figures but forces as dynamic as their male counterparts. Catholic missionaries tried to replace them with virgin saints, yet rural healers still whisper prayers to them during harvests. Domestic spaces held power too. The steam baths called temazcals were women's domain, places for healing and ritual. Herbalists brewed remedies there, willow bark for pain, maize fungus for wounds. Spanish doctors dismissed these practices until they saw fevers break under leaf poultices. Even childbirth had martial aspects. Women who died in labor were honored like fallen warriors, their spirits becoming fierce protectors. Some legacies hide in plain sight. Modern Mexican cuisine owes much to Aztec women's knowledge, nixtamalizing maize with lime to unlock nutrients, balancing chilies with squash blossoms. The molcajete mortar they used to grind salsas still sits in kitchens today. These weren't just chores, but skilled arts, passed mother to daughter through generations. The imbalance in historical records creates false gaps. No Aztec woman appears in Cortez's letters except as gifts or victims. But court documents reveal Nahua women suing for land rights, adapting Spanish law to defend ancestral claims. One 1547 petition describes a grandmother recalling property boundaries by referencing a tree that blooms red when the corn tassels. Such details slip through the cracks of official histories. Contemporary scholars piece together these fragments. Brushstrokes on pre-conquest pottery show female scribes at work. Burial sites contain female skeletons with healed battle wounds, perhaps warriors or defending their homes. The Florentine Codex depicts elderly women teaching history to children, keeping stories alive under occupation. History isn't just what gets carved in stone. It's in the fingerprints pressed into clay incense burners, the wear patterns on grinding stones, the lullabies sung in Nahuatl to infants who'd never see Tenochtitlán. These quiet traces remind us that civilizations aren't built by kings alone, but by countless hands shaping daily life, most of whom history never names. The spindle whorls might say it best, found in their thousands, each slightly different, some inscribed with the owner's name, others with whimsical animals. They spin a thread connecting past to present, one ordinary woman's work to another's. Not monumental, but enduring. Like civilizations themselves, they're made stronger by the countless small strands woven together, most invisible but all essential. After all, it takes many threads to make cloth, and many lives to make history. The Templo Mayor didn't disappear when the Spanish tore it down. It just went underground, piece by piece. For centuries, people walked over its remains in Mexico City's Zocalo Square without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Then, in 1978, electrical workers digging near the cathedral struck something strange: a massive carved stone disc, nearly 11 feet across. The discovery of the Coyolxauhqui monolith, depicting the dismembered moon goddess, sparked what became the most important Aztec archaeological project of our time. Digging here isn't simple. Mexico City sits on soft lake sediment that's been sinking steadily since the Spanish drained the waters. Archaeologists work in constant danger of groundwater flooding their trenches. Modern buildings press in on all sides. One mishap with a backhoe could destroy irreplaceable artifacts. The team proceeds carefully, brushing away dirt with dental tools in some spots. They've found over 14 objects so far, from jade beads to sea turtle shells brought from distant coasts. Each layer reveals different construction phases. Like pages in a book no one could read for 450 years, the Coyolxauhqui stone changed everything. Its discovery proved Spanish accounts describing the temple's location weren't exaggerating. The circular slab once lay at the pyramid's base, where sacrificial victims were thrown down its steps, just as the goddess was thrown from Coatepec Mountain in myth. Nearby, workers found 100 offering caches containing everything from coral to wolf skeletons, each placement following precise ritual logic. One held the remains of a young boy surrounded by jade beads, likely a sacrificial offering to Tlaloc, the rain god. Modern Nahua communities watch these excavations closely. Some elders consult with archaeologists, explaining symbolism that textbooks miss. A curved serpent head might represent not just a decoration but water mountain, a mythical source of fertility. When workers uncovered a rack holding over 200 human skulls, the Tzompantli, described in Spanish texts, local indigenous groups requested special ceremonies before its study proceeded. These collaborations reshape how we understand finds. That storage room, full of pots, might actually be a ritual space where water spirits were honored. Tourists today walk glass walkways over excavations, peering down at trenches that reveal centuries layered like cake. In one spot, you can see a Spanish colonial wall built right atop Aztec masonry. Nearby, polished floor stones still bear grooves from centuries of bare feet. The site museum displays finds in the order they were uncovered, letting visitors follow the detective work from that first electrician's discovery to the ongoing digs. The most striking thing isn't any single artifact but their sheer quantity. Seashells from both oceans, crocodile skeletons, ceramic flutes shaped like birds. The Aztecs gathered objects from across their world to nourish this sacred center. Archaeologists estimate they've uncovered less than half the complex so far. The rest waits beneath adjacent streets and buildings, including rumored royal tombs that could rewrite history. Construction crews now call archaeologists whenever they hit something unusual during city projects. Last year, subway tunnel workers uncovered another ceremonial platform near the old lake shoreline. The stones refused to stay silent. Each discovery chips away at the colonial narrative that sought to bury this culture forever. Stand here at sunset when the crowds leave, and you might hear something unexpected: water. The old springs that fed Tenochtitlan still flow somewhere below, their presence revealed by sensors measuring underground humidity. The city that rose from a lake hasn't entirely forgotten its beginnings. Diggers sometimes find fresh flowers left anonymously on excavation barriers, offerings from people who still remember what this ground means. The past isn't gone here. It's just been waiting its turn to speak. You probably used Nahuatl words today without realizing it. That guacamole you ate? Its name comes from the Nahuatl, ahua guacamole, meaning avocado sauce. The chocolate in your dessert traces back to Xocolotl, a bitter Aztec drink seasoned with chili peppers. Even casual words like chipotle, smoked chili, and coyote, trickster, are borrowed directly from the language of Tenochtitlán. About 200 Nahuatl words survive in modern Spanish, with dozens passing into English through trade and conquest. But the language itself nearly disappeared. After the Spanish conquest, Catholic priests burned Nahuatl manuscripts and banned its use in formal settings. For generations, speaking it openly risked punishment. By the 20th century, fewer than 1 million speakers remained, mostly elderly farmers in remote villages. The language seemed destined to fade away, like the empire that created, yet Nahuatl proved harder to erase than the Spanish expected. Missionaries had unwittingly preserved it by transcribing religious texts. Their 16th century grammars now help modern linguists reconstruct pronunciation. In mountain towns, elders kept oral traditions alive through folk tales and songs. One ballad tells of a hummingbird stealing fire from the gods, its verses preserving phrasing unchanged for 5 centuries. Recent efforts have brought Nahuatl back into the light. Mexico City subway announcements now play in Nahuatl alongside Spanish. Poets like Natalia Toledo write contemporary verses using classical forms, describing city life in the language of old Tenochtitlan. A heavy metal band, Semicon, performs entirely in Nahuatl, their lyrics drawn from warrior chants. Even video games feature the language. The 2017 game Aztecs used reconstructed Nahuatl for its dialogue. The survival isn't perfect. Modern speakers often mix Spanish words into Nahuatl, creating a hybrid tongue scholars call Neo-Nahuatl. Some original meanings have shifted subtly. The word tonal, once meaning life force, now often means just sun. But the core remains. In Zongolica, Veracruz, children still learn counting songs their ancestors would recognize. Cooks use Nahuatl terms for traditional ingredients that have no Spanish equivalent. What makes this revival remarkable isn't just the vocabulary, but the worldview embedded in the language. Nahuatl expresses ideas differently than European languages. There's no word for I love you. Instead, you'd say Nimitznezkauhulia, meaning I make you complete. Time isn't linear but cyclical, reflected in verb forms that emphasize repetition rather than endpoints. Even insults carry poetic weight. One traditional curse translates to, "May you wander like a hummingbird," implying restless dissatisfaction. The Templo Mayor excavations unearthed an unexpected linguistic artifact in 2016, a Spanish priest's notebook with Nahuatl scribbles in the margins. Some scholar, perhaps hiding heresy, had written song lyrics between Latin exercises. The words described a flower's short life, each line echoing the very Aztec poetry the church tried to erase. 500 years later, similar verses are being written anew. Language revitalization faces challenges. Many young Nahua prefer Spanish for economic opportunities. Only about 20 schools teach Nahuatl immersion programs. Yet the 2020 Mexican census showed speakers increasing for the first time in centuries, now around 1.7 million. Some are reclaiming ancestral names, replacing Juan with Xochitl, flower, or Cuauhtémoc, descending eagle. Next time you order tacos, listen to the words tomato from tomatl, chili from chili, even taco, possibly from tlaco, middle. The Aztecs aren't just in museums, they're in our mouths every day. Languages don't need pyramids to endure. They just need someone, somewhere, to keep speaking them into the quiet spaces of ordinary life. The Aztecs called our current age the fifth sun, the fifth world created after 4 previous ones had been destroyed by jaguars, hurricanes, fire, and floods. They believed this era too would end in catastrophe, destroyed by earthquakes when the cosmic balance collapsed. Their astronomers watched for signs in the stars. Priests performed rituals to delay the inevitable. And yet, here we are. The earthquakes came, but not the end. Their descendants still walk the same lands, speaking variations of the same language, growing the same crops. The prophecy was wrong, yet right in ways the Aztecs couldn't have imagined. Modern Nahua communities hold ceremonies where elders recount the old stories, but now they blend them with Catholic saints and new struggles. In Milpa Alta, farmers still offer corn to Tlaloc before planting, though they might call him St. John now. Activists invoke Cuauhtémoc's resistance when protesting pipelines crossing ancestral lands. The Aztecs feared the end of their world, but what came was transformation, not oblivion. The same hands that built chinampas now plant organic maize cooperatives, adapting ancient techniques to climate change. Art keeps the connections alive. Muralists paint Aztec motifs on city walls not as relics, but as living symbols. A street artist in Puebla reimagines Coyol Sauqui's shattered body as a protest against femicide. Contemporary jeweler artists set obsidian blades in silver, turning weapons into statement necklaces. The National Museum of Anthropology displays a modern reinterpretation of the sunstone, lasers projecting moving glyphs onto its surface technology and tradition in uneasy truce. Academia plays its part. Linguists work with elders to compile Nahuatl dictionaries for dialects on the brink of extinction. Archaeologists employ LIDAR scans to find lost settlements under jungle canopies, every new excavation rewriting textbooks. Even chefs get involved, reviving pre-Hispanic recipes with ingredients like amaranth and huitlacoche, selling them in upscale Mexico City restaurants. The past isn't just studied anymore. It's consumed, debated, lived. Children learn this legacy early. Some Mexico City schools teach the Mexican New Year, calculated using the original 360-day calendar. Grandparents show grandchildren how to fold amate paper figures, though the bark books their ancestors wrote on are rare now. In Xochimilco, canal tours pass both floating mariachi bands and quiet chinampas, where farmers work much as their ancestors did. The old and new coexist, sometimes uneasily, but always in conversation. Predictions of cultural death were premature. Over 1 million Nahuatl speakers keep the language evolving, texting emojis with classical glyphs, composing rap lyrics about border politics in ancestral meter. The Spanish burned the codices, but descendants repainted them from memory. The temples fell, but their stones still whisper in archaeological digs. The fifth sun hasn't set it, just looks different than expected. The Aztecs measured time in lifetimes, not minutes. From that vantage point, their civilization isn't gone. It's in the tortilla dough at a Oaxacan market, in the steps of danzantes at the Zocalo, in the stubborn survival of a Nahuatl lullaby sung to a sleeping child. Maybe the earthquakes did come the conquest, the epidemics, the cultural aftershocks, but seeds buried deep in the rubble kept sprouting. The cosmic balance shifts, but somehow holds. After all, even the sunstone had space for a fifth era. Why wouldn't the people deserve the same? The Aztecs built a world where time was circular, where gods bled for corn, where cities floated, and though that world is gone, its echoes remain. In quiet places, a farmer planting maize the old way, a poet crafting Nahuatl verses, an archaeologist brushing dust from a jade mask. Rest well, knowing history isn't just something we read, it's something we carry. If stories like this help you unwind, you might enjoy our video on Maya civilization, same calm tone, new ancient world to explore. Until then, good night from Tenochtitlan's shadow, where the past lingers like the scent of copal incense at dusk.